Electric Stage is an interactive promenade performance that explores nightclubs as a contested site and a site of multifaceted meaning that is responsive to the world around it. Our work aims to replicate the intricate webs of interactions that take place in the club experience and investigate the history of transgression, liberation, regulation, and commercialization that nightclubs encompass.
As a group, we are collectively interested in the possibilities of looking at public space through dramaturgical analysis. As a starting point in our process to create a performance event, we set out with the question, how do spaces and sites of everyday life outside the realm of drama perform? This is where our research began. It is useful to understand how we define dramaturgy in relation to its use as a tool to investigate public space. While dramaturgy is certainly a slippery term, we can conclude that it is generally to do with the composition in relation to time, context, and process. While dramaturgy is unfixed in its meaning, Cathy Turner puts it well, stating dramaturgy is a way of viewing composition as critically creative, always in process, always working itself out, always being redefined by the dynamic connections and exchanges between internal elements and between these and their external contexts. With this understanding, we can apply our use of dramaturgy to address structures outside of the traditional theatre setting. Put simply, in the context of public space, dramaturgy helps us to understand how the components at play in these sites work together to make meaning and dictate behaviour. Dramaturgy helps us to understand the connective networks, cultural assemblages, and social interactions at play in these sites. The way that bodies act in public spaces has been explored in sociological study for many years and is now a recognised and significant branch of sociology as a discipline. The investigation of everyday in sociology grew from a dissatisfaction of the focus on the macro, which failed to capture the complexity and diversity of individual experience of day-to-day life. So we now look to study people within their natural contexts. Sociologist Irving Goffman's The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life invokes dramaturgical language to discuss the human behaviour in the arena of social interaction or socialisation. Goffman suggests that actors, people, perform identity based on their location, audience, cultural values, norms, and beliefs. Our actions are then dictated by the space and the people within that space. We can imagine ourselves as the directors in theatre of everyday life. We carry out dramaturgical analysis in studying what interaction is appropriate. What is revealed from sociological research into everyday life and public space is that structures and spaces are not independent of the people that use them. By looking at how individuals and communities interact and behave in everyday life, we're able to better understand the macro, how the wider structures and networks at play in our societies are cultivated, how we situate ourselves within those structures and networks, and how we seek to change them if we so choose. It is clear that dramaturgy is a relevant method of analysis when looking at public space. Our approach will take influence from both of these understandings. Dramaturgy is composition, the building blocks that make meaning, and dramaturgy is a process of dictating behaviour in response to our surroundings and contexts. Our performance event, Electric Stage, looks to interrogate nightclubs as a public space, and we look to create a piece that exhibits the multifaceted experience of the club. The piece depicts nightclubs as a site of contestation, with a deep history of being responsive to the events of society. They are often associated with political movements, social rebellion, and are spaces of protest, self-expression, violence, and more recently, government or capitalist regulation and institutionalisation. Clubs exhibit the push and pull between positive transgression, community, and shared experience, issues of law and disorder, antisocial behaviour, danger, and criminal activity. Sylvia Reef comments on the multiplicity of clubs in her writing, Club Cultures, Boundaries, Identities, and Otherness, saying, "Clubbing spaces and experience are inscribed with images of transgression, freedom, and liberation. As spaces commonly associated with fun, enjoyment, and leisure, they are frequently described as an other reality or an otherworldly environment, whose absorbing atmosphere facilitates the distanciation from routines of everyday life, paradoxically, while reproducing routines quite similar to everyday contexts. It's also important to note our position, investigating nightclubs from a Western-centric standpoint. While certain elements are common within dance and club cultures across the globe, for example, the music listened to, the fashion, or the drugs taken, nightclubbing is not a singular culture, and cultures remain inherently tethered to local histories, traditions, and social, political, economic circumstances they exist within. The structure of our performance event is influenced in part by Night Fever, a curated art installation exhibit by Jochen Eisenbrand, Catherine Rossi, and Katerina Serralus, a project which toured audiences through 4 rooms which displayed the history of club culture globally, from the emergence of a new youth culture in Europe in the 1960s, the history of dance music, the commercialisation of the nightclub, and the global dissemination of nightclub trends and the club as a force for community, urban planning and gentrification.
Throughout the development of our pitch, we have highlighted 3 key aspects of nightclubs. 1, that they are inherently theatrical spaces. 2, that they hold great potential within our society as sites of socialisation, identity forging, community building and escape. And 3, their role as sites for potential resistance. Perhaps one of the most potent examples of nightclubs as a space for community and identity creation is its role as a rite of passage. Jeremy Northcote explores this idea and states how reaching the legal drinking age gives adolescents access to the exclusive club settings, where not only are they able to rehearse adult activities, but entry to them constitutes a status marker in itself. A new stage of life begins with being able to join the clubbing crowd. This idea of clubs being a rite of passage is only strengthened by the fact that club nights seem to be a main fixture for most university freshers' weeks. The inclusion of nightclubs and nights out in the welcoming of new students also furthers the idea of clubs being used as a space for socialisation and for community building. As discussed by Ben Malbon, by entering a club we enter a space in which we hope to find like-minded people, a space which we identify with, or at least would hope to, and a space in which we can encounter shared styles and notions of belonging.
Our performance experience, Electric Stage, begins before participants even enter the club space. Our box office will check participants into the performance and, in keeping with a common club practice, give them a colored wristband. The color or mark will be randomly assigned upon ticket purchase and will signify a particular status within the club environment, though they will not be informed of their wristband color's significance. From then on, all members of the performing ensemble will treat the club-going participants in accordance with their wristband. For example, if a green wristband is higher status than a blue wristband, the recipient of a green wristband may be ushered to the front of the queue when waiting to be allowed in by the bouncer. Meanwhile, a participant with a blue wristband could be questioned by the bouncer, perhaps remarking on the unsuitability of their clothing or their not looking like, quote-unquote, the right type of person. Perhaps those with green wristbands will be given priority service at the bar or better access to tables, while those with the blue wristbands will be passed over for such amenities. These wristbands will simulate the experience of club entry, which is often fraught as attendees wait for the judgment of the bouncers based on profiling rooted in race, class, gender, and more. The door, says Ben Malbon in an excerpt from his research journal on the nightclub experience, is one of the few places that clubbers sometimes have to literally prove their identity, both in the simple sense of age, but also in the more complex sense of passing themselves off as the right type of clubber for that club, proving their social identity. The door becomes a defining moment, the moment when you both partially take on and are partially ascribed an identification. There is likewise a gendered performance on the part of the bouncer, who Dick Hobbs notes is usually a figure of hypermasculine aggression. Our bouncer will similarly be performed with a traditionally hypermasculine flair. While no audience member will be turned away, we intend for this entry encounter to color the participants' continued experience in our club performance. We hope to have them reflect on their discomfort and the discrepancies in their treatment. As Ruben May says of those who are hassled by bouncers for their attire, their experiences are complicated by the feeling that they are still not readily welcomed. We have drawn inspiration for the entryway experience from both other promenade performances and from active contemporary club spaces before COVID, of course. As mentioned earlier, the use of wristbands or hand stamps to denote status, including legal drinking age, payment of cover charge, or even VIP status, is commonplace within the club space. Some clubs, like the queer-owned House of Yes in New York City, acknowledge the pattern of profiling that takes place at club entrances and seeks to address them by sharing mood boards online for each evening, suggesting attire for attendees in a more inclusive and accessible manner. Other promenade performances, like Punch Drunk's Sleep No More, separate participants from their group as they explore a club-like space that contains a fractalized retelling of Macbeth. In separating attendees that may have arrived in a group, as our wristband assignments may do as well, Sleep No More gently destabilizes its audience and encourages them to explore the space with an altered perspective. We intend for Electric Stage to impart a similar effect. It is also important to again reiterate that these wristbands will be assigned at random, hopefully situating some of those white, middle or upper class, quote-unquote cool patrons who might otherwise have a privileged club experience in a place of unfamiliar disadvantage, while BIPOC patrons or patrons from lower class backgrounds may experience a privileged club experience they often only witness from the wrong side of a velvet rope.
As with theatrical spaces, in clubs we can identify how the use of music and sound create a specific mood or ambiance. This is then supplemented by the use of lighting and effects to enhance the atmosphere. For example, as explored by Melbourne, the use of lighting or lack of it, thick smoke, dry ice and even raining foam are a way of disorientating the public, encouraging a feeling of being in an otherworldly state. Brian Rill then builds on this by explaining how music is often incredibly loud and encourages participants to lose touch with material reality, drifting among the soundscapes like a flowing river. When thinking of the club as theatre, the dance floor undoubtedly takes centre stage. It is the hub of most activity and offers the public the space for creative expression. As Melbourne states, dancing, a key part of the clubbing event, is based largely upon notions of spatio-temporally bounded belongings and group dynamics and is strongly implicated in processes of identity creation. This, paired with the crowd dynamic and the sense of being a part of something much larger than yourself, is what makes nightclubs incredibly fertile ground for community building. There is also evidence of how the act of dancing itself with others encourages us to form bonds with other people. For example, in the article Not All About Sex, Neural and Biobehavioral Functions of Human Dance, Christensen et al. Discuss how dancing, moving in synchrony and cooperation establish affiliation among individuals, as these activities and the sharing of positive experiences increase the levels of oxytocin and prolactin, endocrine markers of social attachment and bonding. This feeling of closeness or community that we find when dancing with others is then amplified by the nightclub settings itself. As with our production Electric Stage, clubs also provide an immersive experience for its audience. The clubbers, as Melbourne states, constantly both produce and consume the activity in which they partake. The dance floor is a public space where the public take on the role of both audience member observing and actor being observed. In this surveyed state, the participant listens and creatively responds to the music, and through dancing, the participant is able to act out any of the numerous roles dancing can take on, such as being used as a way of attraction, escapism, or even resistance.
The inspiration for our next room is drawn from rave culture in the late 1980s and early 1990s, where house music was imported to the UK from Chicago via Ibiza. Dance music and club culture offers a forum for marginalised people within society to resist societal norms and partake in active protest against a society that wishes to repress them. As a project based in Glasgow, a post-industrial city with strong roots in its working class identity, we identified the 1980s and Thatcherism as a poignant moment in clubbing history that should be reflected in our performance. Fiona Buckland discusses the nightclub as a public forum, drawing from Habermas's definition of the theatre as a sphere where political participation is enacted through the medium of talk, and countering that by defining the club and dance as political participation through the embodied action of dancing. As discussed by Abby, our performance is drawn on the idea that movement and dancing in the sphere of the nightclub becomes a legitimate venue for protest, political discussion and liberation. Thatcherism saw a rapid rise in austerity politics, leading to unemployment and increase in poverty for the working classes in society. Those living in industrial towns were particularly punished by Thatcher's politics, as the closure of industry and lack of funding and resources left many without jobs or direction. Coupled with an increased interest in law and order and more powers for police, working class communities were at particular disadvantage during this era of governance. Working class people living in Britain at this time faced unsure futures and the turmoil of the world they once lived in becoming hostile towards them. In this uncertain landscape, young people embraced nightlife as an act of rebellion. Acid house music became the soundtrack of choice at raves, which often took place in warehouses, abandoned airstrips, large empty fields, or anywhere else promoters could find. Rural locations were preferable. House music was accessible in that, after initial outlay for equipment, it was a relatively cheap and fast way to create new music. DJs sampled sections from different tracks from a variety of genres in order to create new music with a specific sound, focusing on the energy of the track. This hapdash DIY mosaic structure creating music suited the sporadic and messy assemblance of the raves. They were in different makeshift venues on the outskirts of society, inhabited by people who were structurally displaced. This combination nurtured an environment with great possibility for liberation, as ravers were acting in such a way that was a direct fuck you to Thatcherist politics. People indulging in pleasurable activities that were unproductive, partaking in illegal activity, and altogether being uncivilized together and in unity. Raving is, in this sense, the antithesis of individualism, as it relies on community of people with common goals and judgment-free space. Ramsey Alaquil states the importance of rave is less involved with the specifics of music but the gathering of people. Our inspiration for this piece is drawn from the world of audio-visual installation art. We aim to create a full sensory experience. Artists such as Marcus Lyle, who is best known as part of the creative team in charge of the Chemical Brothers live shows, create site-specific visual installations and act as inspiration for the visuals of our piece. His work is often experimental, participatory and digital. Using techniques from his repertoire such as pulse response, we believe it would be possible to create visuals unique to each participant's involvement. Additionally, visual artist Weircore creates pieces drawn from the aesthetics of rave culture. Neon lights, early PC imagery, ritual futuristic imagery, and so on. We've also drawn from Kieran Hurley's Beats, which explores rave culture in the 90s and explores the sheer kinship it brings for young people. In order to recreate the feeling of immersion ravers experience without the involvement of illicit substance, our room will include the hypnotic beats of house music paired with trippy visuals reminiscent of the artists previously mentioned. The pulse sensor, a device that will be attached to participants that tracks your heart rate and matches the visuals to your heart, will ensure an experience that is both individual and together, with each participant experiencing their own version of the music but in a community of others enjoying the same encounter. This room will mimic the dual relationship of that club rave experience. The aim of this room is education, liberation and reflection, particularly for younger participants. It will educate on the history of clubbing as an act of resistance. The union of the visuals and music paired with the community experience will juxtapose the projection elements of the room, where on the walls of the room will be projected headlines and article snippets which demonstrate the moral panic around rave culture at the time. Participants will be free to roam the room as they please, reading, listening, dancing, watching and feeling. As participants enter the space, they should feel the barriers of the outside world breaking down as the rave itself becomes the most prominent, sensorially unavoidable condition of the space.
Whilst not an area curated for the public, club toilets certainly impact the dramaturgy of the overall clubbing experience. Public toilets exhibit an interesting conflict. In them, we do the private in public. In recent years, more broadly, public toilets have become highly politicised and a place of heated debate in relation to trans and non-binary identities. Toilets are an inherently gendered space, and hegemonic society pertains that one must fit into the category of male or female to be allowed entry. Kath Brown comments on this, stating, "While the practice of separating public toilets into male and female may not be universal, where they are sites that can be problematic for those who move between apparently distinct sex categories. The moments where boundaries of gender difference are overtly enforced can illustrate how sites and bodies are mutually constituted within sex power regimes. However, nightclub toilets exhibit different qualities and are often a valued part of the experience. For women particularly, even though this is shifting with the introduction of gender-neutral bathrooms in public spaces, the club toilet is often seen as a safe space of kinship where they can take time away from the preying male gaze on the dance floor. There is a sense of community cultivated in these spaces, presenting as a neo-tribal group in that it is temporary and fleeting, but represents an escape from the pressure of the outside world, and do not exclude outsiders. Membership in neo-tribes is fluid and transient. For many women, toilets are more than a watering hole, albeit a pretty grim one. For women and femmes, there is space for new and random friendships, collective validation, and a borrowing lash glue, but also a necessary escape to safety in numbers." In Electric Stage, we wanted to translate the experience of community felt in the nightclub toilets through a participatory space for reflection and discussion. The toilet room will have a large open space with both cubicles and urinals to emulate the modern-day gender-neutral toilet experience. Aesthetically, the rooms will be softly lit with neon lighting and entirely mirrored. It will feel expansive. Mimicking club toilets, there will be memories from the creative team written all over the space on the mirrors, walls, stall doors of club experiences and fragments of moments remembered from past club experiences. Audiences will be invited to add to the installation and write down their own memories. The toilet in our piece will become an autobiographical site in which artists and audience members can curate the space with their own histories, not unlike the way that returning to bars and clubs that we've been to before holds memories of events that happened there, who we spoke to, and what we did. In this room, we were heavily inspired by the play Overflow by non-binary performance artist Travis Alabanza, performed by trans actor Reese Lyons. The piece explores trans identities and toilets as a site of community, but also fierce discrimination. In one scene, Lyon's character discusses passing as a female in a club toilet and temporarily becoming friends with a group of girls who took her in as one of their own. We were inspired by the aesthetics of this piece, but also looked to translate that feeling of community. Preceding the various law changes and regulations and public moral panic surrounding club culture, the early 2000s exhibited a shift to a more institutionalised club experience. The nightlife industry became a commercial product in the UK, with the cultural and entertainment sectors capitalising on nightlife and leisure for profit, local communities and cities using nightclubs as a product to attract tourism and economic gain. Many now fear that nightclubs in the UK are a dying industry, and in 2015 it was noted that nearly half of nightclubs in the UK had closed in the previous 10 years, about 1,500 sites. While this may be due to lifestyle changes of young people and a lack of cultural sector funding under Tory government, the institutionalisation and commercialisation of clubs has changed the experience. The summer of love in the late 1980s and the rave culture of the 1990s doesn't exist in the same way. We wanted to explore this decline and present a utopian-esque experience, a hyper-capitalistic idea of what a nightclub might feel like if the decline and commercialisation of these spaces continues. Audience members are shuffled into cubicles where they are shut off from other audience members. In the cubicle, they are given a small area where they can dance, and headphones which are attached to a cord by a wall of the cubicle. They are only able to pick from a select songs of a pre-approved playlist, and are given a small plastic cup of alcohol. Inscribed on the walls of the cubicles are the names of every club venue which has closed in the UK over the last 10 years. This part of the installation looks to envision a future for clubbing, even if quite a dystopian one.
Eventually, the night must come to an end. This phase is often referred to as the afterglow. Psychiatrist Walter Pankey described afterglow as an elevated and energetic mood with a relative freedom from concerns of the past and from guilt and anxiety. First-hand accounts from active club goers will often cite this phase as their favorite. Some could argue that many individuals go out for the night mainly in the hopes of experiencing an extended afterglow. Ben Melvin writes in his research, "Clubbers prefer to talk about and reflect upon the night, in some way beginning to order the chaos of which they have been a part just a short time previously. There is often the need for a place to spend a few hours chilling out, drinking coffee, and maybe eating or smoking. Although not part of the clubbing experience in the narrow sense, in that they do not usually occur within the club, these processes and practices of reflection and the attempts at interpretation and understanding that can occur in the immediate post-clubbing come-down, afterglow or chill-out period, performs an important role for the clubbers. This stage of the night thus represents a vital transitional phase between the night out and the wider lives and other identifications of the clubbers." To mimic this essential phase for our audience, we are going to create a calming and relaxed environment where participants can process their experiences with others, much in the same way we would naturally share stories of our night with friends over some snacks and cigarettes. This room is modeled after the frothing space, designed by Rick Lander, to help immersive audiences transition out of their experience. Much like immersive audience members, clubbers experience much of their night at an individual level in a heightened state, but it is important to share a period of time with others during the come-down. The Afterglow room will have comfy seating, bright but calm lighting, and will supply snacks, coffee, and other treats. The room will also be set up partially inside and partially outside, allowing participants to share over a cigarette or just enjoy the evening air. In David Overend's studies on clubbers as audiences, he acknowledges the complex fluctuation between observer and spectacle, and argues that this unique experience causes the individual to form a relationship with the art and the environment. This comfortable final phase of our installation will allow the participants to acknowledge and recognize the roles they have taken on throughout the evening, and will give them the transitional period they need to come down from what Overend calls their oceanic experience, and to re-engage with the so-called straight world. Many clubbers also crave the chance to see and be seen. Just as they have taken on two roles on the dance floor, so do individuals need a social space to be both spectacle and observer. The most vital element of this final act is that it must be dictated by the audience. When recounting their experiences, clubbers repeatedly emphasize the agency and power they feel in the late night, early morning hours while experiencing their afterglow. They often feel a euphoria of being unbound by spatial restrictions. Quote, "You know that you can carry it on afterwards, or you can go out Sunday night, or you can go out. You can go out anytime you like. It's not just stretching it out, it's the fact that you can take your pick. At night, there's people everywhere like you, and it's your place, your time." Unlike some of the previous scenes, where individuals are pushed to enter another space or allowed to remain only for a certain amount of time, the Afterglow room will stay open and available as long as people wish to remain. They can leave when and if they want to. This agency is not only an expectation of a night out, but it is vital for a productive experience with our installation. How you end an experience is how you remember it.
The dramaturgy of nightclubs is various and complex, whilst also managing to be individual. As previously mentioned, no two clubs are the same, and although there are global resonances in club culture, each nightclub is inherently a product of the world it exists within. The club carries with it all the messiness of the outside world, while also offering the chance for an escape to an otherworldly experience of freedom. And it was this push and pull that we looked to explore in Electric Stage, the club as a site of conflict. We then argue that nightclubs exhibit a dramaturgy of multiplicity, of community and difference, of liberation and oppression, of protest and regulation. The dramaturgy of Electric Stage aims to reflect these numerous collisions and explore the public site of the nightclub as a space that is heavily loaded with contrasting meanings. And why explore nightclubs? What do we feel is important about them? Nightclubs are clearly an important part of our cultural heritage, not only as a space for self-expression, exploration of identity, youth development, and a social interaction, but, like theatre, they hold a mirror up to society. In using dramaturgy to explore nightclubs as a complex space, we're able to better understand our history, politics, and interactions with one another.